Overview. Braveheart is a 1995 American epic historical war drama film directed and co-produced by Mel Gibson, who also stars as the lead character Sir William Wallace, a late 13th century Scottish warrior. The film tells the story of Wallace leading the Scottish people in the First War of Scottish Independence against the brutal reign of King Edward I of England, also known as Longshanks. This is not just a war movie. This is a film about the human spirit, about love, sacrifice, betrayal, and the burning desire to live free. It is a film that grabs you from the very first scene and does not let go until the very last breath. The story is inspired by Blind Harry's 15th century epic poem titled The Axe and Deidis of the illustre and valiant champion Sir William Wallace. So the roots of this story go back centuries, making it all the more powerful and meaningful. This is not a fictional tale pulled from thin air. This is a story that has been remembered, retold, and passed down through generations of Scottish history and literature. The screenplay was written by Randall Wallace, who took this ancient poem and shaped it into one of the most emotionally gripping scripts ever put to film. The film was produced by Mel Gibson's own production house Icon Productions along with the Ladd Company, and was distributed by Paramount Pictures across North America, while 20th Century Fox handled international distribution. It came at a time when Hollywood was producing big, bold cinematic experiences, and Braveheart stood above all of them. It was grand in scale, deeply emotional in its storytelling, and absolutely stunning in its visual presentation. The cinematography was handled by John Toll, whose breathtaking work behind the camera captured the raw, rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands in a way that had never been seen on screen before. Where it was made and who made it. Braveheart is an American production, made in the United States under Mel Gibson's creative direction. However, the actual filming took place primarily across Scotland and Ireland between June and October of 1994. The production team went to extraordinary lengths to capture authentic landscapes that matched the story's setting. Key filming locations in Scotland included Glen Nevis Valley, where the village of Lanark was actually constructed from scratch, and the stunning areas around Loch Leven and Glen Coe, which provided the rugged mountain terrain seen throughout the film. The opening aerial shots were captured near Eonaich Egach in the Scottish Highlands, immediately establishing the grand and sweeping visual tone of the entire movie. The majority of the remaining scenes, including the massive battle sequences, were filmed in Ireland, mostly within a 30-mile radius of Dublin. The famous Ardmore Studios in County Wicklow served as the interior filming base. The English town of York that appears in the film is actually Trim Castle in County Meath, a massive historical ruin that the production team brought to life with enormous wooden structures and a gate that alone weighed 7 tons. The Battle of Stirling was filmed on the Curragh Plain, and the Battle of Falkirk was shot at Ballymore Eustace. The production design by Tom Saunders was extraordinary, dressing up ancient Irish castles and landscapes to create the feel of medieval Scotland and England with remarkable authenticity. The film was directed by Mel Gibson, who was 38 years old at the time of production. Interestingly, Gibson had initially declined to direct the film, feeling he was too old for the role of Wallace. However, Paramount Pictures would only agree to finance the project if Gibson starred in it, and so he eventually agreed to both direct and act. The screenplay was crafted by Randall Wallace, who had no direct family connection to the historical William Wallace but felt a deep personal connection to the story nonetheless. The music was composed by the legendary James Horner, whose score for Braveheart became one of the most iconic and emotionally stirring soundtracks in cinema history. Plot details. The story begins in the year 1280 AD. Scotland is thrown into a state of chaos and vulnerability following the death of its king, who died without leaving an heir to the throne. King Edward I of England, known to the people as Longshanks, sees this as the perfect opportunity to extend his empire and swiftly invades Scotland. The Scottish nobles, lacking unity and courage, capitulate to English rule without mounting any serious resistance. Young William Wallace witnesses the devastating consequences of this English domination firsthand when his father and brother are killed fighting against the English forces. Following this tragedy, his uncle Argyle, played by Brian Cox, takes William abroad to continental Europe, where he receives a thorough education and grows into a strong, intelligent, and principled man. He learns languages, philosophy, and the arts of war, all while carrying the grief and fire of his homeland in his heart. When Wallace returns to Scotland as a grown man, played by Mel Gibson, he tries to live a quiet and peaceful life. He reconnects with his childhood sweetheart, Murran MacClano, played by Catherine McCormick, and the two fall deeply in love. Knowing that Longshanks has enforced a cruel law known as Prima Noct, which grants English lords the right to take newly married Scottish brides on their wedding night, Wallace secretly marries Murran in a private ceremony under the night sky to protect her from this violation. However, peace proves impossible under English occupation. When English soldiers attempt to assault Murran, Wallace fights back and manages to save her initially. But when the soldiers make a second attempt and capture her, she is brought before the local English magistrate, who publicly executes her by slitting her throat as an act of punishment and intimidation. This moment is the turning point of the entire film. The death of Murran transforms Wallace from a man seeking peace into an unstoppable force of vengeance and revolution. Consumed by grief and fury, Wallace leads his clan in a brutal and decisive attack on the English garrison stationed in their village, killing every soldier and sending a clear message across the land. Word spreads fast. Men from across Scotland, tired of living under the boot of English oppression, begin to rally behind Wallace. His childhood friend Hamish Campbell, played by Brendan Gleeson, becomes one of his most loyal and fierce companions throughout the entire journey. Wallace leads his growing army to a series of remarkable military victories. The most celebrated of these is the Battle of Stirling, where Wallace employs brilliant tactical thinking to defeat a far larger and better equipped English army. This victory shakes the very foundations of English control over Scotland and makes Wallace a legend across the land. His reputation grows so large and so fast that even the Scottish nobility begins to take notice, including Robert the Bruce, played by Angus MacFadyen, the young nobleman with a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne who is caught between his own ambitions and his admiration for Wallace's courage. As Wallace's rebellion grows stronger, Longshanks becomes increasingly desperate and begins using both military force and political manipulation to undermine it. He sends Princess Isabel of France, played by Sophie Marceau, to negotiate with Wallace. However, the princess, who has no love for her cruel English husband Prince Edward, becomes personally moved by Wallace and his cause. She begins feeding him information about English military plans, becoming a quiet ally in a world full of betrayal. The betrayal, however, comes from the very people Wallace fights for. Several Scottish nobles, motivated by greed and self-preservation, make secret deals with Longshanks behind Wallace's back. At the catastrophic Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's forces are outmaneuvered and crushed when the Scottish cavalry, bribed by the English, retreats from the battlefield at the crucial moment. The defeat is devastating. Wallace survives, but his rebellion suffers a near-fatal blow. He discovers that Robert the Bruce himself was among those who betrayed him at Falkirk, a revelation that cuts deeper than any wound from a sword. Despite this crushing loss, Wallace refuses to stop fighting. He continues his guerrilla campaign across Scotland for several years, becoming a ghost that the English cannot catch and a symbol that the Scottish people cannot forget. Eventually, through treachery and deception, Wallace is captured and brought to London in chains. He is tried as a traitor to the English crown, a charge he refuses to accept since he never pledged allegiance to England in the first place. Longshanks offers Wallace one final chance to avoid execution if he simply declares loyalty to the English crown and begs for mercy. Wallace refuses. He is subjected to a horrific public execution, tortured brutally in front of a crowd. The English expect him to break and cry out for mercy. Instead, with the very last breath left in his body, Wallace screams the word that has defined every moment of his life: freedom. It is one of the most powerful moments in the history of cinema. His death, rather than ending the rebellion, ignites it. Robert the Bruce, finally awakened to his own sense of purpose and honor after years of compromise and cowardice, leads the Scottish army into battle at Bannockburn, carrying the memory and the legacy of William Wallace with him. The film ends with the promise of the freedom that Wallace gave his life to achieve. Cast. The cast of Braveheart is exceptional from top to bottom. Mel Gibson plays Sir William Wallace and delivers what many consider to be the defining performance of his career. He brings raw physicality, deep emotional vulnerability, and an undeniable screen presence to a role that demanded everything from him both as an actor and as a director. Catherine McCormack plays Muireann mac Lano, Wallace's secret wife and the love of his life. Despite her limited screen time, McCormack's performance is tender, warm, and heartbreaking, and her death is the emotional engine that drives the entire film forward. Sophie Marceau plays Princess Isabelle of France, the wife of the weak Prince Edward and the woman who becomes quietly drawn to Wallace's cause. Marceau brings elegance and quiet defiance to the role. Patrick McGoohan delivers a chilling and memorable performance as King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks. He plays the villain with cold, calculating menace, making Longshanks one of the most convincing and frightening antagonists in epic film history. Angus MacFadyen plays Robert the Bruce, the conflicted Scottish nobleman torn between political survival and moral courage. His arc from weakness to leadership forms one of the most important emotional threads of the entire story. Brendan Gleeson plays Hamish Campbell, Wallace's most loyal friend and right-hand man throughout the rebellion. Gleeson brings warmth, humor, and tremendous heart to the role. Brian Cox plays Uncle Argyll, the man responsible for raising and educating the young William Wallace after the death of his father. James Cosmo plays Campbell, Hamish's father, and one of the elder warriors who joins Wallace's cause. Peter Hanley plays the cowardly and ineffectual Prince Edward, and David O'Hara plays Stephen, the unpredictable and wildly entertaining Irish fighter who joins Wallace's army. Release date and box office. Braveheart had its first screening on May 18, 1995, in Seattle, Washington. It was then given a wide release across the United States on May 24, 1995. Made on a budget of approximately $72 million, the film went on to gross over $75 million in the United States and Canada alone. Internationally, the numbers were even more impressive, bringing the worldwide total to over $213 million, making it a significant commercial success by any standard. Awards and recognition. The awards recognition that Braveheart received was nothing short of extraordinary. At the 68th Academy Awards held on March 25, 1996, the film received a total of 10 nominations and walked away with 5 Oscars, the most of any film that night. It won Best Picture, Best Director for Mel Gibson, Best Cinematography for John Toll, Best Film Editing, and Best Makeup. Winning Best Picture and Best Director simultaneously cemented Braveheart as not just a popular blockbuster, but a work of genuine cinematic artistry recognized by the highest authority in the film industry. Trailer and tone. The theatrical trailer for Braveheart captured everything that makes the film extraordinary. It opened with sweeping shots of the Scottish Highlands, massive armies facing each other across misty fields, and the haunting notes of James Horner's unforgettable score building beneath it all. The trailer positioned the film as an epic of rare emotional and visual power, and audiences responded to it immediately. The tone of the film itself balances grand battle sequences with deeply intimate moments of love and personal grief, which is precisely what separates Braveheart from ordinary war epics. It is not just a film about armies and kingdoms. It is a film about one man's heart, and what he was willing to sacrifice for the people he loved and the land he called home. Final thoughts. Braveheart is more than a movie. It is an experience. It is a film that reminds you what it feels like to believe in something so deeply that you are willing to give everything for it. From its thunderous battle sequences to its quietest moments of love and loss, every single frame of this film was crafted with passion and purpose. Mel Gibson did not just make a movie. He made a monument to courage. And more than 3 decades after its release, Braveheart continues to inspire, move, and electrify audiences all over the world. The Complete Story of Braveheart, 1995. Part 1. The World Before the Storm. The story of Braveheart begins in Scotland in the year 1280 AD. It is a land of breathtaking natural beauty, of mountains, mists, and open fields, but beneath that beauty lies a nation in crisis. The King of Scotland has died without leaving behind an heir to the throne, and this single fact has created a vacuum of power that England is more than happy to fill. King Edward I of England, a man of iron will and absolute ruthlessness known to his enemies, and even to his own people as Longshanks, moves swiftly and decisively. He invades Scotland not with a declaration of open war but with political cunning, exploiting the disunity among the Scottish nobles to extend English dominion over the entire land. The Scottish nobles, each more interested in protecting their own estates and privileges than in standing together for their people, offer little meaningful resistance. Scotland falls under the shadow of English rule almost without a fight at the highest levels of power. It is in this world that we first meet William Wallace as a young boy. He is a quiet, observant child living in a small Scottish village, the son of Malcolm Wallace, a farmer and fighter who carries in his chest a deep and unquenchable love for Scotland. Young William witnesses firsthand the treachery of the English when Longshanks invites the Scottish nobles to a gathering under the pretense of peace and negotiation, only to have them all hanged. William's father Malcolm and his older brother John ride out to investigate and to resist, and they do not come back alive. The sight of his father's body, and the grief that follows, leaves a mark on young William that will define the rest of his life. He is a boy who has already learned that the world can take everything from you without warning or mercy. Following the deaths of his father and brother, William is taken under the care of his uncle, Argyll Wallace, a well-traveled and educated man who understands that the greatest weapon a man can carry is not a sword but a sharp and informed mind. Argyll takes William away from Scotland, away from the poverty and danger and grief, and into Europe, where the boy receives an education that goes far beyond what any village school could offer. He learns to read and write in multiple languages. He studies philosophy, history, and strategy. He grows into a man of depth and intelligence, someone who carries the fire of his grief quietly but steadily within him, never letting it burn out, never forgetting where he came from or what he lost. Part 2. The Return and the Marriage. Years pass. William Wallace returns to Scotland as a grown man, and the Scotland he returns to is a nation living under the grinding weight of English occupation. English soldiers patrol the villages. English lords hold authority over Scottish lands and Scottish lives. The people live in a state of suppressed anger and quiet desperation, going about their daily routines while the presence of foreign soldiers reminds them constantly that they are not free in their own homeland. Wallace has no intention of starting a rebellion. He is not a revolutionary looking for a cause when he rides back into his home village. He simply wants to live, to reconnect with the land of his birth, to find some measure of peace after a childhood defined by loss. He is a man who has seen enough of the world to know that peace is precious and that violence extracts a terrible cost from everyone it touches. It is in this quiet return that Wallace meets again the girl he had known as a child, Muireann MacLano. She has grown into a young woman of courage and grace, someone who carries herself with a dignity that is not diminished by the poverty and fear that surround her. Wallace and Muireann are drawn to each other immediately, their connection rooted in shared memory, shared loss, and a shared understanding of what it means to grow up in a land that is not truly your own. Their courtship is tender and cautious, conducted with the kind of care that people use when they have already learned how quickly beautiful things can be destroyed. Longshanks has imposed across Scotland a law known as Prima Noct, a feudal rule granting English lords the legal right to spend the wedding night with any newly married Scottish bride before her husband. It is a law designed not merely for pleasure but for humiliation, a deliberate instrument of psychological domination intended to break the spirit of the Scottish people by violating the most intimate and sacred boundary of family life. It is the kind of cruelty that does not just wound one person but poisons an entire community. Knowing this, Wallace does not abandon his love for Maran. Instead, he finds a way to protect her. He arranges for them to be married in a small, private ceremony in the forest at night, witnessed by only a handful of trusted friends including his childhood companion Hamish Campbell and Hamish's father. Under the moonlight and the open sky, with no English lord present to claim any rights and no official record for the authorities to find, Wallace and Maran become husband and wife. It is one of the most quietly beautiful scenes in the entire film, a moment of pure tenderness set against a backdrop of occupation and fear, two people refusing to let tyranny rob them of love. Part 3. The Spark That Ignites the Fire. The peace does not last. It never does in an occupied land. A group of English soldiers in the village begin to harass Maran in the marketplace, and when Wallace intervenes and fights them off, the situation escalates beyond what anyone could contain. Maran attempts to flee on horseback, hoping to escape the soldiers' attention, but she is caught and dragged before the local English magistrate. The soldiers hold her in the public square. The magistrate, as an act of deliberate and calculated cruelty, draws a blade across her throat and executes her in front of the watching village, leaving her body as a message to Wallace and to every other Scotsman who might think about resisting English authority. Wallace arrives at the village square to find his wife dead. The grief that washes over him in that moment is not the loud, theatrical grief of dramatic performance. It is something quieter and more devastating. It is the grief of a man who understood the value of what he had and who now holds in his arms the absolute confirmation of his deepest fear, that love in an occupied land is always vulnerable, always a target, always something that the powerful can use to destroy the powerless. And then the grief becomes something else entirely. It becomes fury. It becomes purpose. It becomes war. Wallace does not hesitate. He organizes the men of his village and leads a devastating assault on the English garrison. They attack with speed and ferocity, killing every English soldier stationed there. Wallace personally confronts and kills the magistrate who executed Maran, his act of vengeance personal and precise. When it is done, the village is free of English soldiers for the first time in years, and the message sent across the land is unmistakable. A Scotsman has fought back. A Scotsman has won. Part 4. The Rebellion Grows. Word travels fast across Scotland. The story of what Wallace did, of a single man and his clansmen rising up and destroying an English garrison, spreads from village to village like fire across dry grass. Men who have spent years grinding their teeth in silent resentment begin to feel something they had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. They begin to gather. They begin to march toward Wallace. Among those who join earliest and most enthusiastically is Hamish Campbell, Wallace's oldest and most loyal friend. Hamish is a giant of a man, fierce and funny in equal measure, someone whose devotion to Wallace is absolute, and whose physical courage is matched only by his fierce heart. His father Campbell, an elder warrior with a lifetime of fighting behind him, also joins the growing force. These men are not professional soldiers. They are farmers, tradesmen, and laborers, men who have never received military training but who carry in their bodies the accumulated frustration of years of subjugation. Wallace molds them into something formidable. He teaches them discipline and tactics. He understands that raw courage alone is not enough to defeat a professional army, that brains must accompany bravery if the rebellion is to survive long enough to matter. He also welcomes a colorful and unpredictable addition to his forces in the form of Stephen, an Irishman of questionable sanity and extraordinary fighting ability, who wanders into the Scottish rebellion and immediately becomes one of its most entertaining and fiercely committed members. The rebellion also attracts the attention of Robert the Bruce, the young Scottish nobleman who carries one of the strongest legitimate claims to the Scottish throne. Robert is a complicated figure, a man of genuine intelligence and evident conscience who is perpetually caught between what he knows is right and what the political reality of his position demands. His father, an older and more cynical man consumed by his own ambitions for the Scottish crown, constantly counsels Robert toward compromise and accommodation with the English. Robert listens to his father more than he should, and this tension between his better instincts and his political cowardice becomes one of the film's most important and painful storylines. Part 5: The Battle of Stirling. The defining military moment of Wallace's rebellion, and one of the most electrifying sequences in the entire film, is the Battle of Stirling. The English send a large, well-equipped professional army to crush the Scottish uprising before it can grow any further. The two forces face each other across an open field. The English commanders look at the ragged, undisciplined collection of Scottish fighters across from them and feel nothing but contempt. They expect to sweep these peasants aside without significant effort. They have profoundly underestimated William Wallace. Before the battle begins, representatives from the Scottish nobility arrive at Wallace's position, urging him to negotiate rather than fight. They are afraid. They lack his conviction and his willingness to risk everything. Wallace dismisses their caution with words that cut to the heart of everything the rebellion stands for. He tells his men that every man who fights and dies that day will die in his bed many years from now, and that on that day he would give anything to come back and tell his enemies that they may take his life, but they will never take his freedom. It is a speech that transforms already willing men into something unstoppable. Wallace uses brilliant tactical innovation in the battle itself. He had his men carry long wooden spears, pikes of a length that the English cavalry could not anticipate. When the English heavy cavalry charged, expecting to ride down and slaughter the Scottish infantry as they had done countless times before in countless other battles, the Scots raised their pikes at the last possible moment. The English horses were impaled or turned aside in chaos. The ordered charge dissolved into confusion. Wallace then led his infantry in a counterattack of ferocious energy, and the English force was shattered. The victory at Stirling is total and stunning. It is a defeat that shakes England to its core and announces to all of Europe that Scotland has found its warrior. Wallace is celebrated across the land. He is knighted by Robert the Bruce following the battle, a formal recognition of his leadership and his achievement. But Wallace is not interested in titles or ceremony. His mind is already on the next step of the campaign. Wallace leads his forces south into northern England, raiding English towns and bringing the reality of the war to English soil. He sends a message to the English court: Scotland will not be quietly absorbed. It will fight for every inch of itself. Part 6: Longshanks and his schemes. Longshanks is not merely angry at the defeats. He is strategically enraged, and that is a far more dangerous thing. He understands that military force alone may not be sufficient to defeat Wallace. He therefore turns to the other great instrument of English power, money and political manipulation. He begins approaching the Scottish nobility with bribes and promises, offering land and titles in exchange for betrayal. He knows that the Scottish nobles are the weak link in Wallace's coalition, men whose loyalty to the cause of Scottish freedom is always conditional on what it costs them personally. He also deploys his daughter-in-law, Princess Isabel of France, as a diplomatic envoy. Isabel is a woman of considerable intelligence and dignity who is deeply unhappy in her marriage to Prince Edward, the king's son, who is effeminate, weak, and entirely unsuited to leadership. Longshanks sends Isabel to negotiate with Wallace, hoping that she can either persuade him to stand down or at the very least gather intelligence about his plans. What Longshanks does not anticipate is that Isabel will be genuinely moved by Wallace. When she meets him, she encounters not the savage barbarian that English propaganda has described, but a man of obvious intelligence, moral seriousness, and extraordinary personal conviction. She is drawn to him, not merely romantically but in a deeper sense of recognition between two people who both understand what it means to live under the control of Longshanks without the freedom to be who they truly are. Isabel does not betray Wallace. She warns him. She becomes a secret ally within the English court, feeding him information and working against Longshanks from within the palace. Part 7. Betrayal at Falkirk. The Battle of Falkirk is where the rebellion breaks. Longshanks has done his work thoroughly. He has bribed the Scottish cavalry commanders, the noble-born horsemen whose charge was supposed to anchor Wallace's battle plan and protect his flanks. When the battle begins and the English forces engage Wallace's infantry, the Scottish cavalry is supposed to sweep in from the sides and destroy the English lines. Instead, the Scottish horsemen turn and ride away without striking a single blow. They have been paid to abandon their countrymen at the moment of maximum need. Wallace watches the cavalry retreat with a horror that he barely has time to process before the English forces close in around his infantry. Without the cavalry, his flanks are exposed and the English archers pour devastating fire into the Scottish ranks. The battle that was supposed to be another Stirling becomes a catastrophe. Men fall by the hundreds. Campbell, Hamish's father, and one of the great hearts of the rebellion, is struck by English arrows and dies in the field. The Scottish army is broken. In the chaos of the retreat, Wallace discovers something that is almost worse than the military defeat itself. He encounters Robert the Bruce on the battlefield, wearing English armor, fighting on the English side. Robert was part of the coalition of nobles that Longshanks manipulated into betraying the rebellion. The look on Wallace's face in that moment, the raw disbelief and crushing grief of a man who realizes that even those he most admired have sold him out, is one of the most devastating character moments in the film. Robert, for his part, is visibly shattered by what he has done. He knows immediately and fully the depth of his betrayal and the cost of his cowardice. Wallace escapes from Falkirk, but he is a changed man. The battle has taken too much from him. Hamish survives but is grief-stricken over the loss of his father. The rebellion that seemed so close to achieving its goal has been knocked to its knees. Wallace continues fighting in the years that follow Falkirk, conducting a guerrilla campaign across Scotland that keeps the flame of resistance alive. But the grand coalition of nobles and warriors that might have truly liberated Scotland has been destroyed by treachery. Part 8. The Capture and the Trial. Eventually, through the persistent treachery of the Scottish nobility, Wallace is betrayed to the English. Robert Mornay, one of the nobles who swore loyalty to the rebellion and then sold it to Longshanks for land and gold, arranges for Wallace to be captured. Wallace is taken to London in chains, dragged through the streets where the English crowd throws garbage and curses at him, and brought before an English court that has already decided the outcome of his trial before he enters the room. He is charged with high treason against the English crown. It is a charge he refuses to accept on any level. He was never a subject of England. He never pledged allegiance to an English king. He is not a traitor because he never owed England his loyalty in the first place. He is simply a Scotsman who refused to accept that his country and his people could be owned by a foreign king. He is given the opportunity to plead guilty and beg for mercy, which would result in a quick execution rather than the prolonged torture the court has planned for him. He refuses. The court sentences him to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a method of execution designed to inflict maximum suffering and public humiliation. It is intended not merely to kill William Wallace but to destroy the idea that he represents, to make an example so horrifying that no Scotsman will ever again dare to raise his voice against English rule. Part 9. the execution and the final cry. The execution is carried out in a public square in London before an enormous crowd of English citizens who have been told that this man is a monster, a savage, a criminal. Wallace is subjected to brutal and prolonged torture in full public view. The executioners are doing exactly what Longshanks intended, breaking him in front of as many witnesses as possible. Princess Isabel is among those who witness what is happening. She has done everything she could behind the scenes to prevent this moment, sending warnings and working through whatever channels were available to her, but she could not stop it. She approaches Wallace in his final moments, and gives him a vial of liquid that will ease his pain, urging him to take it, to make his passing at least a little less agonizing. Wallace refuses. He will not cloud his mind even now. He will face his death with complete and absolute clarity. The crowd, the executioners, the entire apparatus of English power assembled in that square waits for what they have been promised. They wait for Wallace to cry out for mercy, to beg the king's forgiveness, to finally break and give Longshanks his ultimate victory. They wait for the rebellion to end with the complete capitulation of the man who started it. Instead, Wallace summons every last particle of strength remaining in his devastated body, and cries out a single word with every breath he has left. Freedom. Just that word. Nothing else. No plea for mercy. No recognition of English authority. No submission. Just that single, unbreakable word screamed into the face of everything that has tried to crush him. The crowd falls quiet. Even some of the English spectators, who came to watch a traitor die, find themselves unsettled, moved, or ashamed by what they have witnessed. Longshanks, who has spent years trying to destroy the idea that William Wallace represents, has instead ensured that it will live forever. You cannot kill an idea by killing the man who carries it. You only make it louder. Part 10: The Legacy and the Battle of Bannockburn. In the aftermath of Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce is left to live with what he did and what it cost. He has been wrestling with himself since the moment he rode away from Wallace at Falkirk, and the death of Wallace does not bring him peace. It brings him a reckoning. He was the man with the legitimate claim to the Scottish throne, the man with the resources and the bloodline to lead Scotland, and he squandered his chance repeatedly out of political cowardice and deference to his father's self-serving counsel. Robert the Bruce finally makes his choice. He renounces the compromises and the accommodation and the endless negotiations that have defined his political life up to this point. He takes command of the Scottish forces and leads them onto the field at Bannockburn against the English army. As his horse carries him forward and the armies prepare to clash, he speaks aloud to the memory of Wallace, acknowledging what that man gave and what he himself failed to give when it mattered most. He tells the memory of Wallace to fight with him now. The Scottish army under Robert the Bruce charges. The film does not show us the full battle, but it does not need to. We understand what is happening. Scotland is fighting for itself. Scotland is fighting with the fire that Wallace lit and kept burning even through betrayal, defeat, imprisonment, and death. The freedom that Wallace died crying out for is the very thing that Robert the Bruce is now fighting to secure. The film closes on this image of forward momentum, of a people who refused to stop believing in themselves even when their greatest champion was taken from them. It is a conclusion that earns every tear it produces, because it has spent nearly 3 hours showing you exactly what the price of freedom looks like when it is paid in full. Here is the complete life history of all major actors from Braveheart, 1995. Mel Gibson. Malcolm Gerard Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, a small suburb located north of New York City. He was the sixth of 11 children born to Hutton Gibson and Patricia Riley Gibson. His family was deeply rooted in Irish and Catholic tradition, and both sides of his heritage carried strong connections to Ireland. His mother was born in County Longford, Ireland, and his father, though American-born, was of predominantly Irish descent. Growing up in a household with 10 siblings meant that Mel Gibson learned from the very beginning of his life how to exist in a large, loud, and deeply connected family environment. The values of faith, family, and discipline were central to how the Gibson household operated, and these values would leave a permanent imprint on the man Mel Gibson would eventually become. When Gibson was 12 years old, his father Hutton made a decision that would permanently alter the direction of the entire family's life. The Vietnam War was escalating rapidly, and Hutton Gibson feared that his older sons would be drafted into military service. Rather than allow that to happen, he packed up the family and relocated them all the way to Australia, settling in New South Wales. It was a dramatic and courageous decision, uprooting 11 children from the only country they had ever known and transplanting them to a completely different world on the other side of the planet. For young Mel, this move meant leaving behind everything familiar and learning to adapt to a new culture, a new school environment, and an entirely new social landscape. In Australia, Gibson attended St. Leo's Catholic College, an all-boys Catholic high school, and later completed his secondary education at Asquith Boys High School in New South Wales. He was an average student academically, someone who was not particularly driven by conventional academic achievement, but who possessed a natural intelligence and an ability to observe and absorb the world around him with unusual sharpness. After finishing high school, Gibson found himself uncertain about what direction to take. He briefly considered becoming a chef and also gave thought to a career in journalism, two paths that reflected his practical nature and his curiosity about the world. Neither of these directions ever came to fruition, however, because of something his sister did entirely without his knowledge. Gibson's sister submitted an application on his behalf to the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, one of the most prestigious drama schools in Australia, without telling him she had done so. Whether out of curiosity or a sense that he had nothing to lose, Gibson agreed to audition. Despite having absolutely no prior formal acting experience, he was accepted into the program. This single moment, set in motion by his sister's quiet act of belief in him, changed the entire course of his life. At the National Institute of Dramatic Art, Gibson trained alongside students who would go on to become some of the most celebrated names in world cinema, including Judy Davis and Geoffrey Rush. The training he received there was rigorous and comprehensive, shaping him not merely as a performer but as a complete theatrical artist with a deep understanding of character, text, and physical expression. His film career began while he was still a student. His very first screen appearance came in a low-budget Australian film called Summer City in 1977, a modest beginning that gave him his first taste of working in front of a camera. But the role that truly launched him into public consciousness came in 1979, when he was cast as Max Rokitansky in George Miller's post-apocalyptic action film Mad Max. The film was made on an extremely tight budget, but it carried an energy and a visual ferocity that connected with audiences immediately. Gibson brought to the role a physical intensity and a quiet, smoldering charisma that made Max a compelling figure even with limited dialogue. The film became a significant success in Australia and gradually built an international following, establishing Gibson as a name worth paying attention to. The sequel, Mad Max 2, released in 1981 and known in North America as The Road Warrior, elevated Gibson's profile dramatically on a global scale. The film was bigger, bolder, and more visually inventive than the original, and Gibson's performance as the stoic, battle-worn survivor resonated with audiences around the world. Almost overnight, he went from being a promising Australian actor to an international star. The transition had happened with remarkable speed, but Gibson handled it with a groundedness that would prove to be one of his defining characteristics throughout his career. Between the Mad Max films, Gibson also starred in a completely different kind of project that demonstrated the full range of his abilities. Peter Weir's The Year of Living Dangerously, released in 1982, cast him as a foreign journalist in Indonesia during a period of intense political upheaval. The film was a sophisticated, nuanced drama that required Gibson to operate on an entirely different register from the action hero work he was known for, and he delivered a performance of genuine depth and maturity. Critics took notice. This was not merely an action star playing a role outside his comfort zone. This was a genuinely gifted actor with the range and the intelligence to carry complex dramatic material. The role that made Mel Gibson a true global superstar, however, came in 1987 with Lethal Weapon, directed by Richard Donner. In this film, Gibson played Martin Riggs, a suicidal, reckless, brilliantly instinctive detective partnered with the steadier and more cautious Roger Murtaugh, played by Danny Glover. The chemistry between Gibson and Glover was electric and immediate, one of those rare on-screen partnerships where the dynamic between two actors creates something that neither could produce alone. Lethal Weapon was a massive commercial success and spawned 3 sequels over the following decade, with each installment further cementing Gibson's status as one of the biggest box office draws in Hollywood. The Lethal Weapon franchise ran through 1998 and collectively grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Gibson maintained an extraordinarily productive career, taking on a wide variety of roles that demonstrated both his commercial instincts and his artistic ambitions. He starred in Tequila Sunrise in 1988, Air America in 1990, and Hamlet in 1990, in which he played Shakespeare's most famous tragic figure in Franco Zeffirelli's adaptation. The decision to cast Gibson as Hamlet was met with skepticism by some quarters of the critical establishment, who could not reconcile the action hero with the Prince of Denmark. Gibson silenced most of those doubts with a performance that was vital, physical, and deeply felt. He understood the character not as a literary monument to be reverently preserved but as a living, breathing man consumed by grief and moral paralysis. In the early 1990s, Gibson formed his own production company, Icon Productions, a move that gave him a level of creative control over his projects that few actors of his generation possessed. The first major project he undertook as a director was The Man Without a Face in 1993, a quiet, character-driven drama in which he also starred. The film received mixed reviews but demonstrated clearly that Gibson's ambitions extended beyond performing into the full creative process of filmmaking itself. He was not content to simply show up, deliver his lines, and collect his fee. He wanted to shape stories from the ground up. This directorial ambition reached its fullest and most celebrated expression with Braveheart in 1995. Gibson did not initially plan to direct the film. He was brought the screenplay written by Randall Wallace and agreed to star in it. But when the production needed a director and Paramount Pictures made it clear they would only finance the film if Gibson starred in it, he eventually took on both roles simultaneously. The scale of what he was attempting was enormous. He was directing massive medieval battle sequences involving thousands of extras while also carrying the central emotional performance of the entire film on his shoulders at the same time. The physical and creative demands were extraordinary, and Gibson met them with a commitment and a passion that was evident in every frame of the finished product. Braveheart won 5 Academy Awards including Best Picture and Best Director, the twin pinnacles of recognition in the film industry. For Gibson, the awards were validation not merely of his talent as an actor but of his vision and capability as a filmmaker. He was now regarded not simply as a movie star but as a serious cinematic artist with the skills and the courage to tell stories of genuine historical and emotional magnitude. In the years following Braveheart, Gibson continued to work prolifically. He starred in Ransom in 1996, Conspiracy Theory in 1997, Lethal Weapon 4 in 1998, Payback in 1999, What Women Want in 2000, and The Patriot in 2000. Each of these films performed well commercially, and Gibson remained one of the most bankable stars in the world throughout this period. Signs in 2002, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, was another significant success, and Gibson's performance as a man wrestling with grief and faith gave the film an emotional weight that elevated it above the typical thriller. Gibson's personal life during these years was both stable and complicated. He had married Robin Moore on June 7, 1980, and the couple went on to have 7 children together, 1 daughter and 6 sons, including a set of twins. By all outward appearances, their marriage was one of the more enduring partnerships in an industry notorious for failed relationships. Behind the scenes, however, Gibson was battling a severe and long-standing struggle with alcoholism that would eventually unravel much of what he had built. In 2004, Gibson directed and produced The Passion of the Christ, a film depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, filmed in Aramaic and Latin with English subtitles. The film was one of the most controversial and polarizing projects in Hollywood history, attracting fierce criticism from some quarters for its extreme violence and accusations of anti-Semitic undertones, while simultaneously drawing enormous support from Christian audiences around the world. Commercially, it was a stunning success, becoming one of the highest-grossing films in history at that point. Artistically, it confirmed that Gibson's directorial voice was unlike anyone else working in mainstream cinema, bold, uncompromising, and willing to go to places that other filmmakers would avoid entirely. Then in July 2006, Gibson was arrested for drunk driving in Malibu, California. During the arrest, he made a series of deeply offensive and anti-Semitic statements that were widely reported and caused an immediate and severe backlash across the entertainment industry and the broader public. The incident was catastrophic for his career and his public image. The man who had been one of the most beloved and respected figures in Hollywood became overnight one of its most controversial. His marriage to Robin, which had already been under strain, came apart. Robin filed for divorce in 2009, and their divorce was finalized in 2011, with the settlement reported to be among the largest in Hollywood history. The years between 2006 and 2010 were the lowest point of Gibson's public life. He largely disappeared from the spotlight, his career effectively stalled by the weight of the controversy surrounding him. He worked during this period, but not at the level or with the frequency that had defined his earlier decades. He also became involved in a difficult and publicly acrimonious relationship with Russian musician Oksana Grigorieva, with whom he had a child, and recordings of angry phone calls between them were leaked to the media, further damaging his reputation. The road back was slow and required genuine patience and humility. Gibson began reappearing in smaller and supporting roles, gradually rebuilding his credibility within the industry. The real restoration of his directorial reputation came with Hacksaw Ridge in 2016, a film telling the true story of Desmond Doss, a pacifist soldier who served as a combat medic during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II and who won the Medal of Honor without ever firing a weapon. The film was received with enormous critical acclaim and earned 6 Academy Award nominations, winning 2. Gibson was nominated for Best Director, a recognition that signaled to the industry and to audiences that whatever his personal failings and controversies, his talent as a filmmaker remained exceptional and could not be dismissed. Mel Gibson's life story is one of extraordinary achievement, severe personal failure, and persistent creative resilience. He reached the very top of his profession as both an actor and a director, lost much of what he had built through his own destructive behavior, and then worked steadily to reclaim his standing in an industry that rarely offers second chances. He remains one of the most complicated and fascinating figures in the history of Hollywood cinema. Catherine McCormack. Catherine Jane McCormack was born on April 3, 1972, in Epsom, Surrey, in the south of England. Her early life was marked by a profound and early loss. When Catherine was just 6 years old, her mother died of lupus, an autoimmune disease, leaving her father to raise Catherine and her brother Stephen alone. Her father worked as a steelworker, a physically demanding and modestly compensated profession, and the family lived without the advantages of wealth or social privilege. Growing up without a mother from such a young age, and in a working-class household shaped entirely by her father's quiet determination, gave Catherine a particular kind of emotional depth and self-reliance that would later serve her powerfully as an actress. She was raised in the Catholic faith and attended the convent of Our Lady of Providence for her schooling. The structured, disciplined environment of a convent school gave her a rigorous academic foundation, and she went on to pursue her A-levels at Epsom College. It was during her school years that Catherine first discovered a genuine passion for performance. She participated in school drama productions and found in acting something that resonated with her in a way that nothing else did, a space where the emotional life she carried inside her could be given shape and expression. At 16 years old, she had her very first experience of formal performance when she played the title role in an amateur stage production. The remarkable thing about this early role was that she was asked, as a 16-year-old girl, to portray a 60-year-old Russian woman. The audacity of that challenge and her willingness to attempt it said something important about the kind of actress she would become, someone unafraid of disappearing entirely into a character very different from herself. She later described the experience as one that was well beyond her at the time in terms of interpretive depth, but the attempt itself was what mattered. Following her schooling, Catherine made the decision to pursue acting as a serious professional vocation and enrolled at the Oxford School of Drama, one of the most respected dramatic training institutions in England. She graduated from Oxford in 1993 with a thorough and disciplined training in both classical and contemporary performance methods. Her approach to acting, shaped by this training, was always grounded in truthfulness and psychological precision rather than superficial technique. She wanted to understand the interior lives of the people she played, not merely impersonate them from the outside. Her professional debut came on the stage at the Old Red Lion Theatre in London, where she appeared in a production that gave her first taste of professional performance before a paying audience. Almost immediately afterward, she made her screen debut in a low-budget British film called Loaded in 1994, directed by Anna Campion. McCormack was candid in later interviews about the fact that she had a difficult experience on that production and did not find it a particularly positive introduction to film work. Nevertheless, the role gave her a screen credit and brought her to the attention of casting directors who were working on larger and more significant productions. The role that changed everything for Catherine McCormack came in 1995 when she was cast as Moran MacClano in Braveheart. The casting process for Moran was extremely competitive, with many young actresses being considered for a role that was central to the emotional architecture of the entire film. McCormack brought to the audition a quality that Mel Gibson and the production team recognized immediately, a kind of authentic warmth and quiet dignity that made Moran feel real and fully human rather than a romantic idealization. She was cast, and her performance in the finished film confirmed that the decision had been exactly right. The character of Moran appears on screen for a relatively short period of the film's nearly 3-hour running time, but her presence is felt throughout every remaining minute. McCormack gave Moran a richness and a specificity of feeling that made her death genuinely devastating rather than merely dramatically convenient. She achieved this not through large, theatrical gestures but through small, precise moments of connection and vulnerability that accumulated into something profound. The tenderness she and Gibson shared in their scenes together felt entirely genuine, which is perhaps the highest compliment one can pay to an actor in a romantic role. Following Braveheart, McCormack found herself in the position that many actors experience after a sudden, highly visible breakthrough role, flooded with offers but frequently disappointed by the quality of what was being sent to her. She spoke openly in subsequent interviews about receiving endless scripts for tragic women with long flowing hair, roles that seemed designed to capitalize on the specific visual impression she had made in Braveheart rather than on her actual range and ability as an actress. She was not interested in becoming defined by a single image, and so she began making choices that reflected her own artistic values rather than simply following the commercial momentum of her sudden fame. She appeared in a series of projects that demonstrated her range and her independence as an actress. The Land Girls in 1997 was a period drama set during the Second World War, and Dancing at Lughnasadh in 1998 cast her alongside Meryl Streep in a beautifully observed adaptation of Brian Friel's celebrated play. Dangerous Beauty in 1998 was a richly costumed historical drama set in Renaissance Venice, and Shadow of the Vampire in 2000 put her alongside John Malkovich and Willem Dafoe in a darkly imaginative meta-horror about the making of the silent film Nosferatu. Spy Game in 2001 brought her into a big-budget Hollywood production alongside Brad Pitt and Robert Redford. Throughout all of this screen work, McCormack never abandoned the stage, and it is arguably in the theatre where her truest artistic home has always resided. She made her London West End debut as the lead in a production of Anna Weiss, and went on to appear at the Royal National Theatre in a production of Arthur Miller's All My Sons alongside Julie Walters. Her performance in All My Sons earned her a nomination for the Laurence Olivier Award for Best Supporting Actress in 2001, the theatre world's equivalent of an Oscar nomination, and a recognition that the British theatrical establishment regarded her as one of the genuinely significant stage performers of her generation. She continued to work steadily in theatre throughout the following decade, performing in productions of A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen at the Donmar Warehouse in 2008, The 39 Steps at the Tricycle Theatre in 2006, and various other productions that kept her connected to the live performance tradition that formed the core of her artistic identity. She described theatre repeatedly in interviews as the true actor's medium, a space where the performer has genuine ownership of the work once the director steps away and the curtain rises. In film and television, McCormack continued to build a body of work that was eclectic and consistently interesting. She appeared in 28 Weeks Later in 2007, the sequel to Danny Boyle's celebrated horror film 28 Days Later. In more recent years she has appeared in the acclaimed British television series Slow Horses, playing the character Alex Tropper in a production that has been widely regarded as one of the finest British television dramas of its era. She has also worked as a director and writer in addition to her performing work, writing and directing an episode of the television anthology series Playhouse Presents in 2013, further evidence of a creative ambition that extends well beyond the boundaries of performance alone. Catherine McCormack's life and career represent a particular kind of artistic integrity, someone who emerged from genuine hardship in her early life and built from it a performing career defined not by the pursuit of fame, but by the pursuit of work that genuinely challenged and interested her. She has never chased the Hollywood mainstream with the kind of relentless commercial calculation that defines so many careers in the film industry. Instead, she has consistently followed her own sense of where the most interesting and meaningful work was to be found, whether on a major Hollywood film set, a small studio theatre in London, or a television production that prioritized quality over visibility. Patrick M.C. Guhin. Patrick Joseph McGuhin was born on March 19, 1928, in the Astoria neighborhood of Queens, New York City. His parents, Thomas McGuhin and Rose Fitzpatrick McGuhin, were Irish immigrants who had come to the United States from County Leitrim in Ireland in search of work and a better life, as so many Irish families did during that era. The family's time in America proved to be brief. When Patrick was still an infant of only a few months old, his parents decided to return to Ireland, and the family settled in Mullimore in County Leitrim. Patrick spent the first years of his childhood in rural Ireland, absorbing the landscape, the culture, and the particular Irish way of experiencing the world that would remain part of his sensibility throughout his life even as he moved across continents and built a career that spanned 6 decades. When Patrick was 7 years old, the family moved again, this time to Sheffield in the north of England, where his father found work. Sheffield at that time was a heavily industrial city, built on steel manufacturing and mining, and the working-class communities of Sheffield had a toughness and a directness that shaped Patrick's character in fundamental ways. He attended St. Vincent's School in Sheffield and proved to be a student of particular aptitude in mathematics and boxing, 2 disciplines that seem at first glance entirely unrelated but that share a common demand for precision, discipline, and the ability to think clearly under pressure. When the Second World War began, children from Sheffield and other industrial cities were evacuated to safer rural areas to protect them from potential bombing raids. Patrick was sent to Loughborough in Leicestershire, where he continued his education at Radcliffe College. The experience of evacuation, of being displaced from home and family and placed in an unfamiliar environment, was one shared by an entire generation of British children during the war years, and it cultivated in many of them a quality of self-reliance and adaptability that served them well in later life. At the age of 16, Patrick left school and returned to Sheffield, where he entered the working world without any clear sense of what he wanted to do with his life. He worked a variety of jobs over the following period, raising chickens, driving a truck, and working as a bank clerk, none of which bore any obvious connection to the career that was waiting for him. The moment that changed everything came through a piece of straightforward theatrical luck. He secured a position as a stage manager at the Sheffield Repertory Theatre, and when one of the company's actors fell ill before a performance, McGuhan stepped into the role as an emergency replacement. Whatever happened on that stage that night, it was enough to convince him and the people around him that he had found his calling. He threw himself into theatrical training and performance with extraordinary dedication. He slowly worked his way up from small supporting roles to leading parts within the Sheffield Repertory Company, learning his craft through the demanding, repetitive, and wonderfully educational process of live repertory theatre, where actors perform different plays in quick succession and must master new roles at a pace that builds both skill and confidence at an accelerated rate. From Sheffield, he moved through the regional theatre circuit and eventually reached London, where he performed at the West End and at the Old Vic, one of the most celebrated theatrical institutions in the English-speaking world. He appeared in plays by Shakespeare and Henrik Gibson, developing the kind of classical stage authority that remained the bedrock of everything he did in front of a camera. His film career began in the mid-1950s with a series of British productions that brought him to the attention of a wider public. Passage Home in 1955 and Hell Drivers in 1957 were among his early screen credits, and both films demonstrated a screen presence that was unusual and immediately compelling. McGuhan on screen was never soft or comfortable. He had an intensity and an intelligence in his eyes and in his manner that suggested a man always thinking several layers deeper than whatever was being said on the surface. It was the quality of someone who could not be easily read, and it made him fascinating to watch. His television work brought him to genuine mass popularity in the early 1960s. He was cast as the lead in Danger Man, a spy series in which he played John Drake, a secret agent working on behalf of NATO. The series was enormously popular in Britain and was later repackaged for the American market under the title Secret Agent. McGuhan played Drake with a cool, authoritative intelligence that made the character distinctly his own, someone more cerebral and morally complex than the typical action hero of the era. The show made McGuhan one of the most recognizable and most highly paid actors on British television, a position that opened extraordinary doors. The most extraordinary door it opened was the opportunity to be considered for the role of James Bond. The producers of the Bond films approached McGuhan about playing 007 in Drive No. He turned them down. They also approached him about playing Simon Templar in The Saint. He turned that down as well. His reasons were consistent and reflective of a deep personal moral code. He objected to what he perceived as the sexual promiscuity of both characters, the casual way they moved through romantic relationships without commitment or consequence. For a deeply religious and personally conservative man whose own marriage was one of the truly enduring partnerships of his life, these aspects of the characters were genuinely troubling rather than merely inconvenient. He married Joan Drummond in 1951. And the two remained together until his death nearly 60 years later, a rare and remarkable achievement by any standard and an extraordinary one in an industry where marriages typically have the durability of a summer contract. Together they had 3 children. McGoohan was intensely private about his personal life in a way that was almost paradoxical given the public nature of his professional existence. He was one of the most famous faces in Britain during the 1960s and yet somehow managed to keep the details of his family life almost entirely out of public view, a feat of discipline and boundary setting that few public figures of his prominence have managed. Having turned down Bond and The Saint and having exhausted his enthusiasm for Danger Man after 4 seasons, McGoohan channeled his enormous creative energy into a project that was entirely his own conception. The Prisoner, which he created, produced, wrote in part, and starred in, debuted in 1967 and ran for 17 episodes. The series was one of the most original and philosophically ambitious pieces of television ever made, a surrealist allegory about individual identity, freedom, and the oppressive power of systems, both political and psychological. McGoohan played Number 6, a former intelligence agent imprisoned in a strange and beautiful village from which there is no escape, and where his captors attempt by increasingly elaborate means to discover why he resigned from his position. The Prisoner was unlike anything else on British television or indeed on any television anywhere. It used the conventions of the spy thriller as a launching pad for explorations of identity, consciousness, and the nature of freedom that felt more akin to philosophy or art cinema than to popular entertainment. Audiences were simultaneously captivated and bewildered. When the final episode aired and offered a resolution that was deliberately ambiguous and symbolically dense, the reaction in Britain was one of genuine public outrage. Viewers who had invested 17 weeks in the series felt cheated by an ending that refused to provide the straightforward answers they had expected. The backlash was intense enough that McGoohan felt it prudent to leave London for Los Angeles, which he did, making the American city his base of operations for the remainder of his life. In America, McGoohan built a second career that was less intense and concentrated than his British period but no less distinguished in its individual achievements. He became closely associated with the long-running detective series Columbo, appearing in 4 episodes over the course of the show's run and winning 2 Emmy Awards for his guest performances. He also directed an episode of the series, adding yet another creative credit to a career that had always been about more than simply performing. His first Emmy came in 1975 for an episode called By Dawn's Early Light, in which he played a murderous commandant of a military academy. His second came in 1990 for Agenda for Murder, in which he played a vice presidential candidate who commits murder and attempts to disguise it as suicide, an episode he also directed. His film work in the American period included memorable roles in Escape from Alcatraz in 1979, directed by Clint Eastwood, in which he played the coldly authoritarian warden of the famous prison where Frank Morris, played by Eastwood, engineers the only successful escape in the facility's history. He appeared in David Cronenberg's Scanners in 1981, a science fiction thriller about people with powerful telepathic and telekinetic abilities. And in 1995 he delivered what many consider one of the finest performances of his career as King Edward I of England in Braveheart. The role of Longshanks required McGoohan to embody a particular kind of evil, not the theatrical villainy of pantomime but the cold, intelligent, entirely pragmatic cruelty of a man who regards other human beings as instruments to be used or obstacles to be removed. McGoohan brought to the role a frightening stillness, a sense of absolute certainty and absolute control that made Longshanks genuinely terrifying precisely because he was never melodramatic about his ruthlessness. He was a man who ordered atrocities with the calm composure of someone making administrative decisions. The performance is a masterclass in restraint, in how much more threatening an actor can be when he refuses to raise his voice. Patrick McGoohan largely retired from acting in 2002, withdrawing from the public life that had both sustained and constrained him for more than 5 decades. He died on January 13, 2009, at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California, following a brief illness. He was 80 years old. His wife Joan survived him, as did his children. The tributes that followed his death from colleagues, critics, and fans across the world spoke of a man who had operated at the absolute highest level of his craft while remaining, by the standards of his profession, unusually private, principled, and impossible to categorize. Patrick McGoohan's life was the life of a man who consistently refused to do what was expected of him, who turned down the most famous role in cinema to protect his own moral integrity, who created some of the most original and challenging television ever made, and who brought to every performance he gave a quality of fierce intelligence and uncompromising commitment that set him apart from nearly everyone who shared his era. He was one of the genuinely irreplaceable figures in the history of English-language performance. The budget story and behind the scenes of Braveheart, 1995. The struggle to get the film financed. Before a single frame of Braveheart was ever shot, before a single sword was raised, before a single extra put on a kilt, the film almost did not get made at all. The journey from screenplay to cinema screen was a battle in itself, one that Mel Gibson had to fight with the same kind of stubborn, unyielding determination that William Wallace showed on the fields of Stirling. The story of how Braveheart got financed is a fascinating and often chaotic one, full of studio politics, creative arguments, rejected deals, and the kind of passionate commitment to a project that you rarely see from someone who is simultaneously the lead actor, the director, and one of the producers. The screenplay was originally written by Randall Wallace, a man who had no family connection to the historical William Wallace but who felt a deeply personal resonance with the story when he first encountered it during a visit to Edinburgh, Scotland. He saw a statue of William Wallace and became immediately captivated by the idea of telling this warrior's story on a grand cinematic scale. He wrote the screenplay with enormous ambition, never holding back in his vision of what the film could be. The script was long, expensive, and unapologetically epic in its scope. It called for massive battle sequences, thousands of extras, elaborate period costumes, weaponry, horses, and the kind of production infrastructure that no small or modest budget could even begin to accommodate. The project was initially picked up by producer Alan Ladd Jr. at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of Hollywood's legendary studios with a long history of prestige productions. However, MGM was going through a period of significant internal turbulence at the time, with new management coming in and reorganizing the studio's priorities and commitments. Ladd found himself in the uncomfortable position of a producer whose studio was no longer reliable, and rather than let the project die in the confusion, he took it with him when he left MGM and began looking for a new home for it elsewhere. When Mel Gibson came aboard, first as an actor and then as the director, the project gained enormous commercial credibility. Gibson was at the absolute peak of his box office power in the mid-1990s. The Lethal Weapon franchise had made him one of the most bankable stars on Earth, someone whose name alone on a poster could guarantee a significant opening weekend. Studios understood that attaching Gibson to a project meant a built-in audience of tens of millions of people. However, even with Gibson's name attached, raising the money for a film of this scale was extraordinarily difficult. Warner Brothers came into the conversation as a potential financier, and for a moment it looked as though they might provide the funding the film needed. The discussions broke down, however, over a condition that Warner Brothers attached to their offer. They were willing to write the check, but only if Gibson agreed to sign on for another Lethal Weapon sequel as part of the deal. Gibson refused. He was deeply committed to Braveheart as his next major project and had no interest in being leveraged into another franchise installment as the price of making the film he actually wanted to make. The negotiation fell apart, and Warner Brothers walked away. The financing that eventually came together was a creative arrangement split between two studios. Paramount Pictures agreed to cover 1/3 of the total production budget in exchange for the rights to distribute the film across North America. 20th Century Fox stepped in to cover the remaining 2/3 of the budget in exchange for international distribution rights. This kind of split financing arrangement, where two competing studios essentially co-fund a single production in order to divide the distribution territories between them, was not unprecedented in Hollywood, but it was relatively unusual, and it spoke to the fact that no single studio was entirely comfortable writing the full check for a project of this ambition and cost. Even after the financing was in place, Gibson found himself fighting battles over the money throughout the production. One of the most explosive moments came during budget negotiations with Bill Bernstein, who was representing 20th Century Fox's financial interests in the project. Bernstein was offering a figure that Gibson felt was not sufficient to properly fund the filming of the massive battle sequences that were at the heart of the entire movie. Battle scenes of this scale require enormous resources, from the extras themselves to the costumes they wear, the weapons they carry, the horses involved, the stunt coordinators, the safety personnel, the cameras, the lighting, the multiple days of shooting required to capture all the angles and moments needed. Cutting corners on battle sequences in a film that is fundamentally about war is not cutting corners in one area. It is cutting the throat of the entire production. What made Gibson's fury even more intense was the specific nature of Bernstein's position. Not only was Fox not offering enough money to properly fund the battle scenes, but they were simultaneously expecting a full quarter of the theatrical revenue the film generated on release. Gibson was being asked to accept insufficient resources to make the film properly, while the studio that was short-changing him expected to collect an enormous slice of whatever success the film achieved despite that short-changing. This combination of inadequate investment and maximum profit expectation infuriated Gibson to such a degree that during one particularly heated negotiation meeting, he picked up a glass ashtray and hurled it against the wall. It was the physical expression of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience with studio financial politics while trying to protect a project he believed in with every fiber of his creative being. The total budget that was eventually assembled for Braveheart came to approximately $72 million, with some sources placing the figure slightly lower at around $65 to $70 million. For context, this was a very significant amount of money for a film production in the early to mid-1990s. It was not the most expensive film ever made at that point, but it was firmly in the upper tier of big-budget Hollywood productions. Every dollar of that budget was visible on screen, from the construction of the village of Lanark in the Glen Nevis Valley to the elaborate plate armor of the English cavalry to the thousands of costumes made for the extras who populated the battle sequences. Where the money went is itself a fascinating story. The costumes alone represented a staggering investment of time, craftsmanship, and materials. Every single piece of period-appropriate clothing had to be designed, sourced, and in many cases manufactured from scratch. The hundreds of kilts, tunics, leather armor pieces, chain mail segments, and English soldier uniforms that appear throughout the film required a costume department of considerable size working at full capacity for an extended period before filming even began. The weapons and shields were similarly elaborate, with armorers and prop makers creating thousands of individually crafted pieces that could withstand the physical demands of being used in full-scale battle sequences day after day without falling apart in a way that would be visible on camera. The horses were another enormous expense. The film required hundreds of horses for the cavalry sequences, and horses are extraordinarily expensive animals to transport, house, feed, train, and insure. The safety of both the horses and their riders required specialized stunt coordinators and horse masters with extensive experience in period film production, all of whom commanded premium fees. Insurance costs for sequences involving large numbers of horses performing in battle conditions were substantial, adding yet another layer of financial complexity to an already very expensive production. One of the most brilliant and cost-effective decisions Gibson made during the production was accepting the Irish government's offer to supply members of the Irish Army Reserve as extras for the battle sequences. The Irish government, eager to attract a high-profile international production to Ireland and to showcase the country's landscapes to a global audience, lobbied aggressively to move as much of the filming as possible to Irish soil. As part of that lobbying effort, they offered to make available approximately 1,600 soldiers from the Irish Army Reserve to serve as extras in the film's massive battle scenes. This was an extraordinary offer. Professional extras cost money. Trained soldiers who are already accustomed to physical discipline, following orders, moving in coordinated formations, and enduring long and uncomfortable working conditions in all kinds of weather are an entirely different category of asset. These Irish Army soldiers became the backbone of the battle sequences that made Braveheart visually overwhelming. They were trained in the specific movements and formations required for each battle, taught how to handle the period weapons safely, fitted with their costumes, and deployed with the kind of disciplined coordination that only military training can produce. Gibson later spoke warmly about how remarkable these soldiers were as collaborators, how their professionalism and their willingness to fully commit to whatever was asked of them made the difference between battle sequences that felt like amateur pageants and sequences that felt like actual medieval warfare captured on camera. The battle sequences themselves consumed enormous amounts of the production schedule. A single day of battle filming could involve coordinating hundreds of people, dozens of horses, multiple camera positions, stunt sequences, pyrotechnics, and the logistical management of an operation that in terms of organizational complexity was genuinely comparable to running a small military exercise. Multiple takes of sequences involving this many people and this many moving parts required patience, precision, and a production management team of exceptional capability. The funny and unforgettable moments on set. Now let us talk about something entirely different, because while Braveheart is one of the most serious and emotionally devastating films ever made, the experience of making it was apparently filled with moments of comedy, absurdity, chaos, and the particular kind of dark humor that develops between people who are spending months together in cold, wet, muddy conditions pretending to be medieval warriors. One of the most consistently funny stories from the production involves the army of Irish soldiers serving as extras in the battle sequences. These men were disciplined military professionals, yes, but they were also human beings with a strong sense of humor and a healthy appreciation for the absurdity of their situation. On multiple occasions during filming, eagle-eyed members of the crew noticed that some of the soldiers playing ancient Scottish warriors in the foreground of shots had very modern accessories visible beneath, or alongside their medieval costumes. Wristwatches appeared on arms that were supposed to be belonging to 13th century Scots. Sunglasses were spotted tucked into belts or sitting on faces between takes and occasionally forgotten about when the cameras rolled. Modern sneakers appeared under the edges of kilts and long shots. Every time one of these anachronisms was discovered on film during dailies, it meant reshooting sequences that had already taken enormous time and resources to set up and execute. The costume department developed an increasingly exasperated relationship with the task of doing final checks on hundreds of extras before each take, an almost impossible job given the sheer number of people involved. The weather in both Scotland and Ireland during the filming period was famously unpredictable, cold, wet, and entirely indifferent to the needs of a film production. Scotland in particular delivered the kind of weather that tested everyone's patience on a daily basis. The cast and crew regularly arrived on location in the early morning hours to find the Highland landscape draped in thick fog that reduced visibility to almost nothing, or lashed by horizontal rain that soaked through period costumes in minutes, or frozen solid under frost that made the ground dangerously slippery for horses and people alike. Mel Gibson, who as director and lead actor had absolutely no option of sitting in a warm trailer while someone else dealt with the elements, reportedly developed an extremely dry and dark sense of humor about the weather as a coping mechanism. He was frequently seen making jokes about the Scottish climate to anyone within earshot, using humor as a tool to maintain morale among a cast and crew that was physically challenged by the conditions every single day. The blue face paint that became one of the most iconic visual elements of the entire film was a source of considerable amusement on set. In the film, the ancient Scots are shown painting their faces blue before battle, a visual choice intended to convey their ferocity, and their tribal identity. Historically, this practice was associated with the ancient Picts who lived in Scotland centuries before the time period of the film, rather than with 13th-century Scots, making it one of the film's most celebrated historical inaccuracies. But regardless of its historical authenticity, the practical experience of applying blue face paint to hundreds of extras and to Mel Gibson himself every morning before filming battle sequences was apparently a source of endless entertainment. The paint took time to apply properly, and it looked completely ridiculous on everyone until they were fully assembled and in position and the camera was at the right distance and angle to transform the absurdity into something genuinely imposing. Gibson walking around between takes in full kilt and blue face paint, directing the positions of hundreds of extras, checking camera angles, reviewing footage, and having quiet conversations with his cinematographer John Toll about the lighting setup, was a daily sight that the crew found endlessly amusing. There is something inherently funny about watching a man in medieval warrior makeup pull out a modern walkie-talkie to communicate with someone on the other side of a field, and this particular contrast between the ancient and the modern was apparently a reliable source of laughter throughout the production. One particularly famous story from the set involves a moment during the filming of one of the large cavalry sequences when a modern vehicle was accidentally captured in the background of a shot. The production team was working hard to maintain the visual integrity of the medieval setting, which meant that any intrusion of modern technology into the frame was a serious problem. Cars, trucks, power lines, modern buildings visible on the horizon, all of these had to be carefully excluded from every shot. On this particular occasion, despite the best efforts of the location management team, a clearly modern vehicle rolled through the background of a cavalry sequence while the cameras were rolling. It was only spotted during the review of the day's footage, at which point the entire sequence had to be identified, evaluated, and in some cases res-hot. The production team's reaction to this discovery was reportedly a mixture of exhausted laughter and profound frustration, the particular combination of emotions that defines life on a large location shoot when things go wrong. Gibson was simultaneously managing two enormously demanding jobs every single day of the production, directing the film and performing the central role in it. This dual responsibility created situations that were both stressful and, in retrospect, genuinely funny. There were moments during filming when Gibson would deliver an emotionally intense scene as Wallace, wait for the director of photography to call cut, and then immediately step out of character to review the take from the director's perspective, critiquing camera positions, lighting, the performances of the other actors, and the overall composition of the shot. The speed with which he could shift from being completely inside the emotional world of William Wallace to being completely in the analytical mindset of the director was remarkable, and reportedly disconcerting to observe for the first time. Actors who worked with him on the film described the experience of watching him do this as one of the genuinely unique things about the production, something they had never seen before and were not sure they entirely understood. Brendan Gleeson, who played Hamish Campbell, is widely known within the film industry as one of the funniest and most entertaining people to share a set with. Gleeson is Irish to the bone, possessed of a sharp, quick, and sometimes devastatingly dark sense of humor that is a direct product of the Irish tradition of finding comedy in difficult circumstances. During the cold, wet, physically demanding days of filming in Scotland and Ireland, Gleeson was apparently an invaluable source of morale for the entire cast and crew. He could deliver a perfectly timed observation about their collective misery in a way that made everyone laugh despite themselves, transforming what might otherwise have been moments of genuine frustration and discomfort into shared experiences of dark comedy. His natural chemistry with Gibson, which translated so powerfully into their on-screen relationship as Wallace and Hamish, was clearly grounded in the genuine warmth and humor of their real working relationship during production. David O'Hara, who played Stephen the unpredictable Irish warrior, brought a quality to his performance that blurred the line between genuine eccentricity and calculated performance in a way that kept everyone around him permanently slightly uncertain about where the character ended and the actor began. O'Hara threw himself into the role with an intensity and a physical unpredictability that made every take genuinely different from the last, and that required his fellow actors to stay sharp and responsive at all times. His commitment was such that between takes he would often continue behaving in character in ways that were both impressive and mildly alarming, moving through the background of the set with the restless, slightly unhinged energy of Stephen even when the cameras were not rolling. This dedication was enormously entertaining for those watching from a distance, though it kept the actors who shared scenes with him in a permanent state of alert readiness. The production also faced a practical challenge with one of its most important visual elements, that became something of a running joke during filming. The kilts worn by the Scottish characters in the film are historically inaccurate for the 13th century, since the belted plaid that we recognize as a kilt was not actually worn in Scotland until several centuries later. Gibson was aware of this inaccuracy and made the deliberate decision to include kilts anyway because they were such a powerful and recognizable visual symbol of Scottish identity that their absence would have confused and disappointed audiences. However, keeping kilts properly arranged and presentable through the physical chaos of battle sequences, which involved large numbers of people running, falling, fighting, rolling in mud, and being drenched in rain, proved to be an ongoing logistical challenge that the wardrobe department dealt with on a daily basis. The sight of costume assistants rushing onto set between takes to straighten, pin, and rearrange hundreds of kilts on hundreds of extras who had just been asked to roll around in a muddy field was apparently one of the more reliably comic recurring moments of the entire production. The extras who played the English soldiers had their own set of challenges and their own share of on-set comedy. The English soldiers in the film wear considerably more elaborate and restrictive armor than the relatively free-moving Scottish warriors, and moving around in full plate armor and chain mail in the physical conditions of the Irish and Scottish locations was an exhausting and frequently awkward business. Extras in full English armor discovered that sitting down was difficult, that climbing in or out of vehicles was a production in itself, that eating lunch required the kind of careful planning usually associated with engineering projects, and that any need to use a bathroom in the middle of a filming day was an adventure that no amount of military or dramatic training had adequately prepared them for. The costume department had naturally anticipated some of these issues, but the day-to-day reality of managing large numbers of armor-clad extras across rough terrain in unpredictable weather exceeded even the most thorough advanced planning. One of the most widely told stories from behind the scenes involves the weather disrupting what should have been a straightforward exterior scene. The production team had carefully planned the day's shooting schedule based on a weather forecast that proved to be entirely wrong, as forecasts in the Scottish Highlands have an ancient and proud tradition of being. The sequence required a particular quality of light and relatively still conditions that would allow the cameras to capture the landscape in the sweeping, majestic way that the scene demanded. Instead, the weather arrived in a completely different form than anticipated, turning what was supposed to be a day of productive filming into a largely wasted expedition to a remote location that was subsequently extremely difficult for the entire production team to get back from. Gibson's response to this particular day reportedly involved the kind of colorful language that cannot be reproduced in a family-friendly video script, delivered with sufficient volume and creativity to be appreciated by everyone within a considerable radius. The post-production process also had its own extraordinary behind-the-scenes story. The composer James Horner, who created the unforgettable musical score for Braveheart, was given an extremely tight deadline to deliver the completed score due to the pressure of the production timeline. Horner composed the majority of the score in under 6 weeks, an almost superhuman feat of creative productivity given the length and emotional complexity of a nearly 3-hour film. The score he produced in those 6 weeks went on to become one of the most beloved and recognizable film soundtracks of the entire decade, demonstrating yet again that extraordinary constraint can sometimes produce extraordinary results. When Gibson first heard Horner's completed score played against the footage of the film, he was reportedly moved to tears, a reaction that seemed entirely appropriate given everything the production had been through to reach that moment. The total financial result of all of this struggle, creativity, chaos, and determination was a film that cost approximately $72 million to make and earned over $213 million worldwide. On a pure financial calculation, the return on investment was significant and validated the faith that everyone involved had placed in the project. But the real measure of what Braveheart achieved is not found in its box office numbers. It is found in the 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, in the standing ovations it received at test screenings, in the tears it produced in audiences around the world, and in the fact that more than 30 years after its release, people are still watching it, still moved by it, and still telling stories about how it was made. The cultural and historical details of Braveheart, 1995. The real William Wallace and his historical context. To truly understand Braveheart as a cultural and historical document, you must first understand the real man at the center of it and the real world he inhabited. William Wallace was a genuine historical figure, not a legend invented for the purposes of storytelling, though legend has certainly accumulated around him in the centuries since his death. He was a Scottish warrior and military leader who lived in the late 13th century, and who became the central figure of the First War of Scottish Independence, the prolonged and brutal conflict that defined Scottish national identity for generations and whose echoes can still be felt in Scottish political life today. The Scotland that Wallace was born into, sometime around 1270, was a kingdom that had existed as an independent entity for centuries, with its own monarchy, its own nobility, its own legal traditions, and its own distinct cultural identity. The Scottish people were not English. They spoke differently, worshipped in traditions that had their own particular character, governed themselves according to their own customs, and thought of themselves as a separate nation with a separate history and a separate destiny. This was not a people who had always lived under foreign domination. This was a nation that had known what it meant to be free and sovereign, and the loss of that sovereignty under English pressure was therefore felt not merely as a political inconvenience but as a profound violation of something fundamental and sacred. The crisis that created the conditions for Wallace's rebellion began in 1286 when King Alexander III of Scotland died unexpectedly, falling from his horse in the dark during a storm. He left no direct male heir, and Scotland was thrown into a succession crisis of dangerous instability. His only potential heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was a child of only 3 years old at the time of his death. Margaret was brought to Scotland but died during the voyage in 1290, leaving Scotland without any clear and uncontested succession. This situation was an invitation to external interference that King Edward I of England, one of the most politically calculating and militarily aggressive monarchs England ever produced, was not going to refuse. Edward I was a man of extraordinary ambition and considerable ability. He had already subjugated Wales, incorporating it formally into the English crown through a combination of military conquest and political engineering. He saw Scotland's succession crisis as an opportunity to do the same thing to Scotland, to absorb it into an English empire that would give him control of the entire island of Britain from the southernmost tip to the northern highlands. He moved carefully and with apparent legality at first, positioning himself as an arbiter in the Scottish succession dispute, inviting competing Scottish nobles to present their claims before him as if he were a neutral and impartial judge rather than a deeply interested party with his own agenda. The outcome of this process was the selection of John Balliol as King of Scots in 1292, but Balliol was a weak figure who quickly came to be seen as Edward's puppet rather than as a genuine independent monarch. When Edward began making increasingly unreasonable demands on Scotland, treating it openly as a vassal state rather than an independent kingdom, Scottish resistance mounted. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland directly, sacking the town of Berwick with terrible violence, and defeating the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. Balliol was forced to abdicate, and Scotland was placed under direct English administration. Edward removed the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, from Scone and took it to Westminster Abbey as a trophy of conquest, a deliberate symbolic act intended to strip Scotland of the visible emblems of its sovereign identity. It was in this world of military occupation and wounded national pride that William Wallace emerged as a figure of resistance. The historical record of Wallace's early life is fragmentary and uncertain. We know he existed and we know what he achieved, but the details of his childhood, his family background, and the specific personal experiences that led him to take up arms against English occupation are not well documented. The primary literary source about Wallace from the medieval period is a long narrative poem called The Acts and Deeds of the Illustre and Valiant Campion Sir William Wallace, written by a poet known as Blind Harry somewhere around 1470, which is approximately 170 years after Wallace's death. This poem, which runs to nearly 12,000 lines, is the basis for much of what we think we know about Wallace's personal life and motivations, but it is a literary work written long after the events it describes and shaped by the conventions of medieval romance and heroic narrative rather than by strict adherence to documented historical fact. Wallace first appears definitively in historical records in 1297 when he killed William de Hazelrig, the English sheriff of Lanark. The reasons for this killing are recorded differently in different sources. Blind Harry's poem attributes it to the English execution of Wallace's wife or lover, a version of events that Braveheart adopts as the core personal motivation for Wallace's rebellion. Other sources suggest different provocations. What is certain is that after killing the sheriff of Lanark, Wallace became a marked man operating outside the law, and he used this position to organize and lead a growing campaign of armed resistance against English occupation throughout 1297. The high point of Wallace's military career came in September 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The actual battle was fought at a river crossing where the English forces had to cross a narrow bridge to engage the Scottish army waiting on the other side. Wallace and his co-commander Andrew Moray used this geographic constraint brilliantly, allowing a portion of the English army to cross before attacking, cutting off those who had crossed from those who had not, and destroying each group in turn. The English suffered a devastating defeat, and the victory established Wallace as the preeminent military leader of Scottish resistance. He was subsequently appointed Guardian of Scotland, a regent-like position that gave him authority over the governance of the country in the absence of a king. The defeat at Falkirk in 1298 ended Wallace's period of military dominance. Edward I led a large, well-supplied English army into Scotland and confronted Wallace's forces on an open field. The Scottish cavalry abandoned the field during the battle, and without their support Wallace's infantry was exposed to devastating English archery. The defeat was comprehensive, and Wallace's position as Guardian of Scotland became untenable. He resigned the guardianship and subsequently spent several years in continental Europe, reportedly seeking support for Scotland's cause from France and the papacy, before returning to Scotland. He was captured in 1305 near Glasgow, betrayed by a Scottish nobleman named John de Menteith, who handed him to the English. He was taken to London, subjected to a show trial at Westminster Hall, and condemned for treason, a charge he specifically disputed on the grounds that he had never sworn loyalty to the English crown and therefore could not technically be guilty of treason against it. His execution was the public torture method known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered, carried out on August 23, 1305, at Smithfield in London. His body was subsequently quartered and his body parts displayed in different locations across Scotland and England as a warning to those who might contemplate following his example. The English meant the display of his remains as a message of absolute finality. What they produced instead was a martyr. Where Braveheart gets history right. Despite the considerable historical liberties the film takes, and they are considerable, there are fundamental historical truths embedded in Braveheart that the film gets authentically and powerfully right, at least in terms of the spirit and the emotional reality of the period, even if not always in its precise details. The broad outline of the political situation the film presents is accurate. England under Edward I genuinely did invade and attempt to absorb Scotland in exactly the politically ruthless and militarily brutal way the film depicts. Edward I was genuinely known as a man of extraordinary ambition and cold efficiency in pursuit of his goals, and his treatment of Scotland was genuinely experienced by the Scottish people as an act of tyrannical oppression rather than legitimate governance. The anger, the humiliation, and the passionate desire for self-determination that the film portrays among the Scottish people were real emotions embedded in a real historical situation. Wallace's role as a military leader who came from outside the nobility, and who built his army primarily from common people rather than from the aristocratic classes, is historically accurate in its broad outline. The Scottish nobility in the 1290s was a deeply compromised class, many of whom held lands in both Scotland and England and therefore had practical financial reasons to seek accommodation with English power rather than resisting it. Wallace, whose position outside the noble class gave him a different kind of relationship to the idea of Scottish sovereignty, did indeed draw much of his following from the common people of Scotland in a way that distinguished his movement from the political maneuvering of the aristocracy. The Battle of Stirling as a real event in which Wallace achieved a remarkable military victory through superior tactical thinking is historical fact, even though the film's depiction of it on an open field rather than at an actual river bridge is one of its most significant departures from historical reality. The Battle of Falkirk as a real Scottish defeat in which Wallace's forces were abandoned by Scottish cavalry is also historical fact, and the subsequent collapse of Wallace's military position and his eventual capture and execution are all drawn from genuine historical record. Robert the Bruce as a figure who eventually became King of Scots and who led Scotland to an important military victory at Bannockburn in 1314 is entirely historical, and the film's portrait of him as a man torn between aristocratic compromise and genuine conviction, while simplified and dramatized, reflects real historical debates about his character and his political choices during the period of Wallace's rebellion. Where Braveheart invents history. Now this is where the film becomes genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective, because its departures from documented history are not random or careless. They are deliberate creative choices that reveal exactly what kind of story Mel Gibson and Randall Wallace wanted to tell, and understanding those choices tells you as much about the cultural moment in which the film was made as it does about the medieval Scotland it depicts. The kilts are perhaps the most visually iconic element of the entire film and also one of its most historically glaring inaccuracies. The belted plaid garment that we recognize today as the Scottish kilt did not exist in the 13th century. It was a development of the 16th century at the earliest, meaning that William Wallace and his contemporaries lived approximately 3 centuries too early to have worn anything resembling what the people in Braveheart wear. The warriors of Wallace's time would have worn tunics, cloaks, and other period-appropriate clothing that would have been considerably less visually dramatic and considerably less immediately identifiable to a modern audience as Scottish. Gibson made the deliberate decision to include kilts anyway, and he has been open about this choice. He understood that kilts had become, in the centuries since their actual invention, the most powerful and universally recognized visual symbol of Scottish identity. Showing medieval Scottish warriors in historically accurate, but visually unrecognizable clothing would have created a film that looked less distinctively Scottish to its global audience, not more. He chose cultural symbolism over historical precision, and the result is that the kilts in Braveheart became themselves a kind of cultural statement, reinforcing and strengthening a visual association between Scottish identity and this particular garment that already existed but that the film made even more powerful and more globally widespread. The blue face paint carries a similar historical complication. The practice of painting the body or face with blue woad was associated with the ancient Picts, a tribal people who inhabited parts of Scotland in the centuries before the medieval period. By the time of William Wallace in the late 1200s, the Picts as a distinct cultural group had long since been absorbed into the larger Scottish kingdom. The men of Wallace's era did not paint themselves blue before battle. This was a practice of a much earlier, and entirely different period of Scottish history. Again, Gibson chose to include it because of its cultural resonance, its power as a visual symbol of ferocity and tribal identity that an audience in 1995 would immediately and viscerally connect with the idea of ancient Celtic warrior spirit. The relationship between Wallace and Princess Isabel of France is one of the film's most dramatically important inventions and also one of its most thoroughly fictitious elements. In reality, Princess Isabel, who in history was Isabella of France, was not yet even born at the time of Wallace's rebellion and capture. She was born around 1295, meaning she was approximately 10 years old at the time of Wallace's execution in 1305. The romantic and political relationship depicted in the film, including the implication that Wallace might have been the father of the future Edward III of England, is a complete invention with no basis whatsoever in historical record. It was created by Randall Wallace as a narrative device to give the film a second important female character after the death of Moran, and to create a dramatic connection between Wallace's rebellion and the English royal family. The law of prima nocte, which the film presents as an official English policy granting English lords the right to spend the wedding night with newly married Scottish brides, is not supported by credible historical evidence as an actual implemented policy in Scotland or anywhere else in medieval Europe. The idea appears in folklore and in various literary traditions, but historians have found no documentary evidence that it was ever formally enacted or systematically practiced in the way the film presents it. It functions in the film as a narrative tool to establish the absolute and intimate violation that English occupation represented to Scottish people, to make the oppression personal and visceral rather than merely political and abstract. Whether it was historically real is less important to what the film is trying to do than whether it effectively communicates the spirit of that oppression to a modern audience. The Battle of Stirling as depicted in the film takes place entirely on an open field. The actual historical battle was fought at the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth at Stirling, and it was precisely the existence of that bridge that made Wallace's tactical approach so effective. The decision to move the battle to an open field for the film was made primarily for practical reasons of film production, since depicting a bridge battle with the scale and visual dynamism the film required would have presented considerable logistical challenges. But it also removed one of the most tactically interesting elements of the real battle from the historical record. The real King Edward I. Edward I of England as depicted in Braveheart by Patrick McGoohan is a villain of almost operatic dimensions, cold, calculating, entirely without mercy, a man who throws his son's companion from a castle window without a flicker of hesitation or remorse. The historical Edward I was genuinely one of the most formidable and in many ways genuinely ruthless monarchs England ever produced, and his treatment of Scotland was genuinely brutal by any reasonable standard, but the film's portrait of him compresses and darkens his character in ways that historical scholarship complicates. Edward I was also one of the great legal reformers of medieval English history, responsible for significant developments in English common law and parliamentary governance that had lasting positive effects on English constitutional development. He was a crusader, a general of considerable ability, and a king who by the standards of medieval European monarchy was in many respects a highly capable ruler. This does not excuse or minimize the genuine brutality of his Scottish campaigns, particularly the sacking of Berwick in 1296, which involved the massacre of a large portion of the civilian population and was widely condemned even by the standards of his own time. But it does mean that reducing him entirely to the cold-blooded villain of Braveheart loses the complexity of a historical figure who was genuinely multidimensional in ways that the film's dramatic purposes could not accommodate. The cultural impact on Scotland. The cultural impact of Braveheart on Scotland itself was extraordinary, far-reaching, and in some respects genuinely historically consequential in a way that very few films about any subject have ever been. When the film was released in 1995, Scotland was in a period of significant political ferment. The question of Scottish devolution, of whether Scotland should have its own parliament with meaningful legislative powers rather than being governed entirely from Westminster, had been a live political issue for years. The previous devolution referendum in 1979 had failed to produce the required majority for devolution to proceed, leaving Scottish nationalism in a state of frustrated suspension. Braveheart arrived in this political environment like a match thrown into dry grass. The film gave Scottish people who had emigrated to other parts of the world and formed large diaspora communities in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, a powerfully emotional and visually magnificent articulation of Scottish national identity and the Scottish desire for self-determination. It told the story of a Scotsman fighting for the right of his people to govern themselves against the domination of a more powerful southern neighbor in terms that were mythological in their sweep and deeply personal in their emotional resonance. For Scottish audiences in 1995, watching Braveheart was not merely watching a historical film. It was experiencing a cultural event that connected their contemporary political aspirations to an ancient story of resistance and sacrifice. The political impact was measurable and significant. Scottish National Party membership and support increased in the years following the film's release. Alex Salmond, who later served as Scotland's First Minister and was one of the driving forces behind Scottish nationalism in the modern era, explicitly acknowledged Braveheart's contribution to the political mood that made devolution possible. In 1997, just 2 years after the film's release, Scotland voted in a devolution referendum that produced a decisive majority in favour of establishing a Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament was subsequently established and held its first session in 1999. While it would be simplistic and reductive to credit a single film with producing this political outcome, the broader cultural shift that Braveheart helped to accelerate was real and documented. The film also produced a dramatic increase in tourism to Scotland. People who saw Braveheart and were moved by its portrait of the Scottish Highlands wanted to go and see those landscapes for themselves. Scottish tourism authorities reported significant increases in visitors from North America and elsewhere in the years following the film's release, with many visitors specifically citing the film as their motivation for choosing Scotland as a destination. The Scottish Highlands, the castles, the historical sites associated with William Wallace, all of these saw renewed interest from a global audience that the film had introduced to Scottish geography and history for the first time. The Wallace Monument at Stirling, which had existed since the 19th century but had been a relatively modest tourist attraction, became a significantly more visited destination after Braveheart. The monument subsequently installed a bust of William Wallace that was modeled to resemble Mel Gibson's portrayal of the character in the film, a decision that generated considerable controversy among historians and purists who objected to the conflation of the real historical figure with the Hollywood actor's portrayal. The bust was vandalized multiple times and eventually removed, but the episode illustrated perfectly the way in which Braveheart had made the line between historical fact and cinematic myth genuinely difficult for many people to distinguish. The film revived widespread interest in Scottish Gaelic culture, language, and music. Traditional Scottish music, the bagpipe traditions, the folk song traditions, and the broader cultural heritage of the Scottish Highlands all experienced renewed popular interest following Braveheart's global success. People who had never previously had any particular connection to Scottish culture found themselves curious about it, seeking out its music, its history, and its traditions in a way that the film had made feel relevant and meaningful rather than merely quaint or ethnographically distant. The film's relationship with Irish culture. It is worth noting that the cultural dimensions of Braveheart extend beyond Scotland to include a significant Irish dimension that is often overlooked in discussions of the film's cultural impact. A substantial portion of the film was made in Ireland, filmed at Irish locations with Irish Army soldiers serving as the extras in the battle sequences. The film's depiction of a Celtic people resisting the domination of a powerful English neighbor had obvious resonances for Irish audiences who understood intimately from their own national history exactly what that kind of resistance felt like and what it cost. Ireland's own centuries-long struggle against English domination, which had produced its own martyrs, its own mythology of resistance, and its own eventual achievement of independence in 1922, gave Irish audiences a particular relationship to Braveheart's themes that Scottish audiences shared, but that was grounded in a different specific historical experience. The film connected with Irish viewers not merely as an entertaining historical epic but as a story that rhymed powerfully with their own national narrative of resistance, sacrifice, and the eventual assertion of cultural and political sovereignty. The Irish soldiers who served as extras in the film brought to their work a physical commitment and an understood cultural resonance that went beyond the technical requirements of the job. These were men who came from a country that had its own William Wallace figures, its own stories of rebellion against English power, its own tradition of celebrating those who had refused to accept foreign domination of their homeland. When they stood in those fields in period costume, and waved their weapons and charged at the opposing forces, they were doing so within a cultural context that gave those actions a meaning beyond mere performance. The film and the broader global discourse of freedom. Braveheart arrived in 1995 at a particular moment in global history that gave its central themes an extraordinary resonance far beyond Scotland or Ireland or any specific national context. The Cold War had ended just a few years earlier, and the nations of Central and Eastern Europe that had spent decades under Soviet domination were in the process of asserting their newly recovered independence, and working out what that independence meant for their cultural and political identities. Countries that had been suppressed within larger empires were discovering and reclaiming their own national stories, their own languages, their own heroes, their own histories that had been marginalized or distorted by the dominant power that had ruled over them. In this global context, a film about a people fighting for freedom against a powerful empire that sought to absorb them into itself was not merely a medieval Scottish story. It was a story that could be claimed and felt by any community anywhere in the world that had experienced or was experiencing the suppression of its national identity by a more powerful external force. Braveheart was dubbed into dozens of languages and screened in countries on every continent, and everywhere it went it found audiences who saw in Wallace's story a reflection of something in their own national experience or aspiration. The film's central cry of freedom, which Wallace utters with his last breath at the moment of his execution, became one of the most widely recognized and quoted lines in cinema history precisely because it expressed something universal rather than something merely Scottish. It gave articulation to a desire that human beings across cultures, across centuries, and across widely different political circumstances have always felt with equal intensity: the desire to live according to their own terms, in their own way, without the coercive domination of external power telling them who they must be. That universality is ultimately what has kept Braveheart alive in the cultural imagination for more than 30 years after its release, long after more technically sophisticated and historically accurate films about related subjects have been largely forgotten. The historical legacy of the film in academic debate. The relationship between Braveheart and the academic historical community has been a complicated and often contentious one. Professional historians, almost universally, have found the film's historical inaccuracies difficult to accept. Scottish historian Alan Massey was particularly pointed in his criticism, arguing that the film's simplistic portrait of Scottish victimhood and English villainy had the potential to feed anti-English sentiment in Scotland in ways that were culturally and politically irresponsible. He argued that bad history is potentially dangerous history, that when a widely seen film presents a version of events that is significantly distorted from the historical record, it shapes the way large numbers of people understand the past in ways that can have real consequences in the present. Other historians have taken a more nuanced position, acknowledging the inaccuracies while also recognizing that the film performed a genuine cultural service by bringing a largely forgotten chapter of Scottish history to global attention. Before Braveheart, William Wallace was a figure well known within Scotland but relatively unknown to the broader international audience. After Braveheart, he became one of the most recognizable figures in medieval history for audiences around the world, his name immediately associated with the cause of Scottish independence and with the broader human aspiration for freedom. Whatever factual distortions the film introduced into popular understanding of his life, it also created a curiosity about that life that sent many people to discover the actual historical record in ways they would never have done without the film's inspiration. The film has been used as a case study in numerous academic contexts to explore the relationship between popular film and historical memory, the question of how cinematic narratives shape public understanding of the past, and the specific dynamics of how national mythology is constructed and maintained through storytelling. In this sense, even the film's inaccuracies have proven historically productive, giving scholars and students a rich and accessible example through which to explore questions about how history is told, who tells it, what purposes that telling serves, and what gets left out or changed in the process of translating historical complexity into dramatic narrative. The film's influence on subsequent historical cinema. Braveheart's cultural impact extended powerfully into the world of cinema itself, where it effectively redefined what a large-scale historical epic could look and feel like in the modern era. Before Braveheart, the genre of historical epic film had largely fallen out of fashion in Hollywood. The great sword and sandal epics of the 1950s and 1960s, films like Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and El Cid, had defined the genre for a generation, but by the 1980s and early 1990s the genre had largely disappeared from mainstream cinema, replaced by science fiction spectacles and contemporary action films. Braveheart demonstrated that there was an enormous global audience hungry for stories of historical scale, personal sacrifice, and human courage told with the full resources of modern filmmaking. Its commercial success, grossing over $213 million worldwide against a budget of approximately $72 million, proved to studio executives and filmmakers alike that historical epics could compete commercially with any other genre. The films that followed in its wake over the subsequent decade reflected this lesson clearly. Gladiator in 2000, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture just as Braveheart had done 5 years earlier, was explicitly and deeply influenced by Braveheart in its approach to battle sequences, its portrait of a lone hero fighting for justice against an oppressive system, and its use of personal grief as the engine that drives the protagonist's public rebellion. The Last Samurai in 2003, Troy in 2004, Kingdom of Heaven in 2005, and numerous other major historical productions of that era all owe a significant creative debt to the template that Braveheart established. The specific visual language that Braveheart introduced into historical epic cinema, its combination of wide landscape photography that used the natural geography of the filming locations as an active participant in the storytelling, its approach to battle sequences that emphasized chaos and physical brutality rather than choreographed elegance, its use of slow motion at moments of maximum emotional significance, and its willingness to let the personal and the political exist in equal weight. Within the same narrative, all of these became standard elements of the historical epic genre in the decade that followed its release.